The flames were still far away, but the feeling that the end was near was already spreading through the heavy air of Stenvik. The walls, which had once been a symbol of power and security, now seemed like mere observers of the impending disaster. Outside, the enemy prepared themselves, relentless, like a wave advancing mercilessly against a rock. Ragnald Iron Fist, leader of the small but fearless band of Vikings, took one last look at the men under his command. He knew there was no way out. There would be no victory. But Viking pride burned in his veins like furnace fire, and one thing he knew for sure: he would not be defeated so easily. Stenvik's warriors were not many, but the battle was never about numbers. Ragnald knew that the true strength of a Viking lay in his ability to fight to the end, even when the odds were against him. As the enemy army approached, they prepared for a bloody war, but not just for survival. Every arrow fired, every trap set, would be a reminder that Stenvik would not fall without leaving its mark. Like an iron fist striking steel, the impact of the resistance would be felt across the land. As the first shadows of enemy troops appeared in the distance, the sound of war grew closer like a distant, menacing roar. But within the gates of Stenvik, there was a silent tension, focused and calculated. The stage was set for a battle that would not be forgotten, and as in all great Viking battles, blood and steel would soon mix, transforming Stenvik into an inferno of fire and fury. The battle was on, and the Vikings would be remembered not for the number of their enemies killed, but for their courage in fighting to the last breath. Stenvik, the city that stands majestically in the lands of Russ, did not come into being overnight. Its origins date back to a time when the dense forests and winding rivers of the Kiev region were still wild, untamed, and only partially explored by men. Situated on the edge of a vast fjord, where the waters intertwine with the gray skies and the mountains rise like sentinels of the ancient land, the city began as a simple settlement of Norse fishermen and hunters, but it would soon become one of the pillars of Viking power in Russ. Long before Stenvik became a center of resistance and stronghold, its first inhabitants were Norse Vikings, descendants of the ancient Scandinavians who had crossed the North Sea in search of new lands and riches. These men and women, known as the Russ, were part of the great Viking movement that spread throughout Europe and Asia, leaving their mark not only as warriors but also as traders, explorers, and colonizers. They arrived from various regions of Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, sailing in their drakkes, the famous longboats, which cut through the seas and rivers with deadly precision, as if they were moving on their own Viking blood. Stenvik was founded around the 9th century, when a group of Norse Vikings, led by a chief named Ragnar, arrived at the estuary where the future settlement would be built. Initially, the land was wild, with impenetrable forests, rivers full of fish, and a harsh climate. The place offered abundant resources, but it also challenged the new inhabitants with its living conditions. However, like all good Vikings, Ragnar and his followers were not intimidated, and instead used these difficulties to their advantage, transforming them into their greatest strengths. Over time, the small Viking village grew, becoming a prosperous town thanks to the trade that the Vikings began to establish with the local people. Stenvik, which in the Norse language meant stone village, got its name from the towering stone cliff that surrounded the fjord, creating a natural fortress. Here, the Vikings began to build houses of wood and stone, creating a network of narrow streets and squares where the inhabitants could gather, trade goods, and celebrate their victories. The houses, with their thatched roofs and reinforced wooden walls, were simple but functional, protecting families from the bitter cold that swept down from the north. Within them, the Vikings lived with a sense of community, sharing the fruits of their hunts and harvests. Stenvik's culture was shaped by its Viking heritage, rooted in the traditions of the Norse, but also influenced by interactions with the Slavic peoples and other tribes that inhabited the vast lands of Rus. Religion, for example, was strongly linked to the ancient Norse gods, such as Odin, Thor, and Freya, and rituals of sacrifice and offerings were common in festivities and celebrations. However, over time, the presence of Christian missionaries in the Rus lands brought a certain religious syncretism, where pagan practices were mixed with a new faith. This created a unique fusion of beliefs that made the city of Stenvik a meeting point for different cultures and ideologies. Life in Stenvik was governed by a Viking code of honor. Loyalty to clan and family was paramount, and courage in battle was seen as a supreme virtue. The Vikings of Stenvik were known for their skill with weapons, especially swords and axes, and for their fierce endurance in combat. But behind their brute strength, there was also a strategic and commercial intelligence that made them formidable adversaries and allies. The bustling and vibrant Stenvik market was one of the largest in the region, with merchants from all over coming to exchange furs, grain, precious metals, and, of course, slaves. The town had become a vital link in the vast trading network that the Vikings had created, stretching to the far reaches of the Byzantine Empire and beyond. Stenvik's warriors, called skalds, sang epic songs about the great battles and conquests of their ancestors. But it was not just the warriors who contributed to the town's growth. Stenvik's craftsmen and blacksmiths were also renowned for their skills, forging weapons and armor that were highly prized throughout Rus. Iron, mined from the nearby mountains, was worked in the forges into sharp blades and sturdy shields. This craftsmanship was not only a source of pride for the Vikings, but also an important tool for their trade with other kingdoms. Over the years, Stenvik became a center of power in the Rus. Its strategic location, close to the rivers that crisscross the land, allowed the Vikings to control vital trade routes between the north and south, between Western Europe and Eastern Asia. But it was not just trade that gave the city its strength. Stenvik had a privileged military position. Its warriors, hardened and well-trained, were always ready to defend the city against any invader. The fortress that had been built on the stone hills became an impenetrable citadel, and its walls of wood and clay were defended by archers, swordsmen, and even warriors on horseback. But, like all great Viking cities, Stenvik was not without internal conflicts. Power struggles were constant between different factions, and disputes over land and resources were not uncommon. Charismatic leaders rose and fell, challenging each other for control of the city and its vast wealth. The councils of elders and the Thing, war assemblies where decisions were made, were the stage for many of these battles of wit and strategy. Stenvik, however, always remained true to its essence, a place where honor, blood, and fire were the forces that guided its destinies. Over time, the city of Stenvik evolved, but it never lost its connection to the warrior spirit that founded it. Its inhabitants, descendants of the first Vikings who had come to conquer and colonize the lands of Rus, kept the legacy of their ancestors alive. The city became a symbol of Viking strength, a bastion of resistance against enemy forces, always ready to face the next challenge, whether on the battlefield or in the treacherous seas that surrounded it. The story of Ragnald Ironfist begins in a small village in the frozen heart of Rus, where eternal winter seemed to rule the lands, and the bitter wind whispered tales of ancient heroes. Born in the spring, however, Ragnald little knew that his journey would be marked by the brutality of the coldest winters and the fiercest battles. Son of Eric, a fearless warrior, and Helga, a woman of unmatched strength and ancient wisdom, he was raised under the shadow of steel and fire. From the first cry, his life was intertwined with the indomitable spirit of the Vikings, and the small village that saw his first breath knew that a future warrior had been born there. As a child, Ragnar found himself surrounded by the stories of his land, told around great campfires. His father, Eric, was a respected leader among the local warriors and was always ready to teach his children the arts of war. From an early age, Ragnar demonstrated an unusual resilience to the cold, a trait many said he inherited from his mother, a woman of ancient and wild lineage who came from the mountains. His early years were spent in constant training, wielding small axes and shields, as if each movement were an extension of his own spirit. Amid the dense forests of Russ, where wolves howled at night and the wind cut through his skin, he learned to hunt and survive. By his teens, he was faster and stronger than the other boys in the village, and his talent with a sword was soon noticed by his father. By the time he reached adolescence, Ragnar had the body of a warrior and the spirit of a leader. Viking blood ran strong in his veins, and his hands were callous from tireless training. His eyes, however, were marked by more than simple strength. He was calculating, strategic, and knew that in a world as brutal as that of Russ, strength alone was not enough. When he turned 15, Ragnar had his first real battle. A raid of raiders from the southern lands attacked his village and killed many of the older men, leaving the women and children defenseless. Ragnar, with the courage of a lion, took charge of the defense. With an axe forged by his own father, he dealt heavy blows against the invaders, cutting off arms and heads with a precision rare for one so young. It was in that combat, under the cold blade of the sword and the weight of the steel, that he first felt the weight of death in his hands. But more importantly, he tasted victory, and this would shape him for the future that was to come. Ragnar's youth was forged in combat. He grew up with a reputation of being an unbeatable warrior, and soon became the best swordsman in the region. His skill with the blade did not go unnoticed, and he stood out for his coolness and control in battle. But behind this skill lay an inner fire, a relentless desire to test his limits. By the age of 20, Ragnar had already led small groups on expeditions and ambushes, always returning victorious. However, he knew that his true test of fire would come when the great Jarl of Stenvik, Halvard, challenged the fate of his city. The Jarl, a man of fearsome reputation but with a leadership that was beginning to be questioned, decided to put the young warriors of Russ to the test. He was older, and his vision of war had been weakened by years of vice and decadence. And so it was that, on a harsh winter day, Ragnar found himself facing Halvard, no longer as a simple young warrior, but as a potential leader. The fight between Ragnar and Jarl Halvard was epic. The battlefield, covered in snow, seemed like an arena of steel and fire, where two worlds collided. Halvard, with his brute strength and experience, seemed a formidable opponent, but Ragnar was more cunning. He knew that victory would not come through strength, but through strategy. With one swift, sure move, Ragnar disarmed the Jarl and, with a strength that seemed supernatural, split his sword in half. Ragnar's victory was not simply a matter of skill, but of understanding that a true leader must know when to fight and when to wait. From that moment on, Ragnar was recognized as the new Jarl of Stenvik, and his journey as a leader had only just begun. When Ragnar became Jarl, the city of Stenvik entered a new era. His leadership was marked by a mixture of brutality and wisdom, and he became known as the Iron Fist, a nickname that arose from the fact that his hands, hardened by cold and steel, seemed to crush any challenge with unrelenting strength. He was ruthless with his enemies, but fiercely loyal to those under his protection. However, like any great leader, his enemies began to multiply. Many of Jarl Halvard's former allies saw Ragnar as a threat, a brash young man who had overthrown a more experienced man. Others, political enemies, saw him as a leader who needed to be destroyed before he could consolidate his power. And so it was that Ragnar came to live under constant threat of betrayal and assassination. With each victory, new enemies emerged, and he knew that the only way to ensure the safety of Stenvik was to keep his strength and power in sight. But adversity never shook Ragnar. Instead, it shaped him even further. He became a more calculating, ruthless man, always ready for the next blow. He knew that he could trust no one completely, for the Rus politics were ruthless and treacherous. Even so, he continued to expand his domain, uniting clans and peoples under his banner, always with an iron fist and a sharp mind. But behind the mask of an unbeatable leader, Ragnar carried the burden of being a man constantly surrounded by the shadow of his enemies. He knew that if he was not careful, he could succumb to these threats. And it was precisely this understanding that made him the Iron Fist, a leader who did not fear challenges, but knew how to face them with ferocity and calculation. Ragnar Iron Fist, after years at the helm of Stenvik, saw his city grow beyond his wildest expectations. The early years of his leadership were marked by conquests and victories, but also by a series of challenges that tested his skill as a leader and strategist. Stenvik, once a small village of fishermen and hunters, had become a center of Viking power in the Rus, a true beacon of trade and war. But Ragnar's rise to power inevitably created enemies. The same men who had once fought at his side began to see his authority as a threat, and the resentment grew like a flame ready to turn into a blaze. The first betrayal Ragnar faced came from within his own circle of allies. Ulfgar, an old war friend, was disturbed by Ragnar's growing strength. The feeling that he was losing control over Stenvik led him to seek other alliances. Ulfgar knew that in challenging Ragnar, he could not simply attack directly. Instead, he sought the support of a powerful Saxon leader, Eadald the Warlord. Eadald was not only an imposing warrior, but also a brilliant strategist, renowned for his victories on the battlefield, and his armies were made up of ruthless soldiers. The promise he made to Ulfgar was simple and enticing. If he surrendered Stenvik, Eadald would grant him gold, lands, and a position of power in his new order. The alliance between Ulfgar and Eadald was forged in the shadows, with secret meetings and silent pacts. For years, they plotted Stenvik's downfall, studying his weaknesses, his defenses, and seeking any flaw that could be exploited. But what they did not know was that Ragnar, while unwaveringly trustworthy, was also cunning and shrewd. He was suspicious of Ulfgar's movements, feeling that the peace he enjoyed in Stenvik was too fragile, and he soon began to notice signs of treachery. However, he knew that he could not act in haste. Patience, careful observation, and complete control of his emotions would be his greatest weapons. Over the next few years, the city of Stenvik flourished, but the winds of war were approaching. Ragnar reinforced Stenvik's walls, trained his army with the discipline of a Roman general, and positioned his best archers and warriors in the towers, ready to respond to any threat. Still, Ulfgar and Eadald's movements continued. Spies and traitors infiltrated the city's streets, disguised as merchants and peasants, gathering vital information for the upcoming siege. The great battle began when the Saxon forces, now numbering 20,000 men, marched towards Stenvik. The Saxon army was well equipped and trained, with a combination of heavy infantry, archers, and horsemen. The first line of attack was made up of heavy-foot soldiers, protected by shields and armed with long swords and spears. Behind them came the archers, ready to launch flaming arrows, while the horsemen advanced under Eadald's command, ready to crush any resistance that appeared at the city gates. But as always, Ragnar knew that brute force would not be enough. He was facing an overwhelming force, and his small army of 200 men was at a disadvantage. However, the Viking spirit ran strong in his veins, and he knew that fighting with honor and courage was the only option. He had led his troops with cunning and bravery all these years, and now, in the greatest battle of his life, he would use everything he had learned. The first hours of the siege were a nightmare of fire and death. Stenvik's walls, though imposing, were far from impregnable. As the first Saxon arrows began to fly, the Vikings on the walls responded with their own hail of poisoned arrows. The sound of bells echoed through the city, and soon the screams of the wounded began to mix with the crash of shields clashing against spears. Ragnald's catapults rained flaming stones down on the Saxon troops, forcing many to retreat temporarily to regroup. The Saxon soldiers advanced, but were held back by the traps and obstacles set by the Vikings. The fire from the catapults lit up the sky, and the smoke of the battle rose like a dark pall over the city. Ragnald knew the battle would be long and difficult. He led his troops with calculating coldness, always observing the battlefield, anticipating the enemy's movements. While his warriors threw stones and arrows, he was on the front lines, fighting alongside his men. His hands, hardened by cold and steel, wielded his sword with the strength of an iron fist, cutting through the enemy lines with merciless fury. Every move was precise, every blow deadly. But with each passing minute, the enemy force grew, and the Saxons advanced with full force. After hours of intense fighting, the Saxons began to realize that it would not be so easy to take the city. Their lines were broken, and the morale of their soldiers was beginning to waver. But more importantly, a shadow of doubt began to spread among the Saxons. Something was wrong. The information they had been given about the weak points of the walls and the city guard was proving to be inaccurate. The allies who had helped orchestrate the siege, those who had plugged the breaches, were disappearing. What the Saxons did not know was that Ragnald had already identified the traitors, those who had passed on false information, and was biding his time to act. As the sun began to set, the battle reached a critical point. The Saxon forces were exhausted, and the Vikings, though equally tired, still had the determination and fighting spirit. Ragnald, with his iron fist, signaled his men to retreat momentarily. He used this moment of confusion to infiltrate the enemy ranks with a small group of loyal warriors. In a series of swift, stealthy attacks, he located the traitors within their own city and executed them, with the cold-bloodedness of a warrior who knew that in times of war there was no room for mercy. With the traitors dead and the battle on the brink of collapse, Ragnald rallied his forces for a final assault. With a war cry, he ordered the offensive. The city of Stenvik, already covered in blood and smoke, became a hell of fire and steel. The Saxons, now greatly outnumbered, were unable to withstand the Viking onslaught. Within hours, the once 20,000-strong force had dwindled to just 500, and the battlefield was littered with bodies, both Saxon and Viking. Ragnald, his sword soaked in blood, gave no respite. He led his troops into the Saxon camp, where the last remnants of resistance were quickly crushed. The victory was overwhelming. Stenvik was once again safe. But this time, victory meant more than the survival of the city. Ragnald had defeated a much larger army, and his name would now be sung in the hymns of the skulls throughout the lands of Rus. With the siege finally broken and the city saved, Ragnald Iron Fist established himself as a legend. Stenvik, once just one Viking city among others, was now a Viking empire in full bloom, ruled by an unbeatable leader who knew how to turn even the most desperate adversity into a resounding triumph. After the great battle that established Stenvik as a Viking power in Rus, Ragnald Iron Fist lived the following years as a revered leader, whose victories and cunning marked his era. The city, now stronger than ever, flourished under his protection. The rubble of war was replaced by new buildings and fortifications, and Ragnald, with the wisdom of a man who had seen countless battles, continued to reinforce Stenvik's walls, always alert to any threat that might arise. Over the years, Ragnald forged alliances with other Viking leaders and even with neighboring kingdoms, ensuring that Stenvik was protected by a network of powerful allies. He made successful raids, expanding his territory and conquering new lands. Yet despite his fame and power, he never let arrogance blind him. With each victory, he knew that the true glory of a leader lay in keeping his city prosperous and his warriors loyal. Under his leadership, Stenvik became a thriving city of trade, learning, and culture, an example of what Vikings could achieve when united in a common purpose. Until his final days, Ragnald remained an imposing figure. His enemies, now scattered or defeated, never dared to challenge him again. He died peacefully, after a lifetime dedicated to his city and his people. In his final moments, Ragnald reflected on the greatness of Stenvik and the legacy he would leave for future generations. He knew that his city, his warrior spirit, and his achievements would be remembered by the Skalds for centuries to come. And so the story of Ragnald Iron Fist would live on, not only as a Viking leader, but as a symbol of strength, honor, and resilience. A city forged in the fires of battle and the valiant hearts of its warriors, Stenvik continued to thrive long after his death, standing as a beacon of power and glory in Rus, forever linked to the name of Ragnald the Iron Fist. Did you like this story? Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next epic sagas. The journey continues.